34. He stayed on in Montpellier for several weeks. He had achieved a certain fame and was invited to salons where he was asked about his life in the cave and about how the Marquise had cured him. He had to tell the tale of the robbers over and over, how they had dragged him off and how the basket was let down and about the ladder. And every time he added more lovely embellishments and invented new details. And so he gained some facility in speaking, admittedly only a very limited one, since he had never in all his life handled speech well. And what was even more important to him, a practiced routine for lying. In essence, he could tell people whatever he wanted. Once they had gained confidence in him, and with the first breath, they gained confidence in him. For they were inhaling his artificial odor, they believed everything. And in time he gained a certain self-assurance in social situations, such as he had never known before. This was apparent even in his body. It was as if he had grown. His humpback seemed to disappear. He walked almost completely erect. And when someone spoke to him, he no longer hunched over, but remained erect and returned the look directed at him. Granted, in this short time he did not become a man of the world, no dandy about town, no peerless social lion. But his cringing, clumsy manner fell visibly from him, making way for a bearing that was taken for natural modesty, or at worst for a slight, inborn shyness that made a sympathetic impression on many gentlemen and many ladies. Sophisticated circles in those days had a weakness for everything natural, and for a certain unpolished charm. When March came, he packed his things and was off, secretly so early in the morning that the city gates had only just been opened. He was wearing an inconspicuous brown coat that he had bought second-hand at a market the day before, and a shabby hat that covered half his face. No one recognized him, no one saw or noticed him, for he had intentionally gone without his perfume that day. And when around noon the Marquis had enquiries made, the watchman swore by all that's holy that they had seen all kinds of people leaving the city, but not the caveman, whom they knew and would most certainly have noticed. The Marquis then had word spread that with his permission, Grenouille had left Montpellier to look after family matters in Paris. Privately, he was dreadfully annoyed, for he had intended to take Grenouille on a tour through the whole kingdom, recruiting adherents for his fluidal theory. After a while, he calmed down again, for his own fame had spread without any such tour, almost without any action on his part. A long article about the fluidum létal Taillade appeared in the Journal des Sçavans, and even in the Courrier d'Europe, and fluidally contaminated patients came from far and wide for him to cure them. In the summer of 1764, he founded the first lodge of the vital fluidum, with 120 members in Montpellier, and established branches in Marseille and Lyon. Then he decided to dare the move to Paris, and from there to conquer the entire civilized world with his teachings. But first he wanted to provide a propaganda base for his crusade by accomplishing some heroic fluidal feat, one that would overshadow the cure of the caveman, indeed all other experiments. And in early December he had a company of fearless disciples join him on an expedition to the Pic du Canigou, which was on the same longitude with Paris, and was considered the highest mountain in the Pyrenees. Though on the threshold of senescence, the man wanted to be borne to the summit at 9,000 feet, and left there in the sheerest, finest vital air for 3 whole weeks, whereupon, he announced, he would descend from the mountain precisely on Christmas Eve as a strapping lad of 20. The disciples gave up shortly beyond Vernet, the last human settlement at the foot of the fearsome mountain. But nothing daunted the Marquis. Casting his garments from him in the icy cold and whooping in exultation, he began the climb, alone. The last that was seen of him was his silhouette, hands lifted ecstatically to heaven and voice raised in song. He disappeared into the blizzard. His followers waited in vain that Christmas Eve for the return of the Marquis de la Taillade, Espinasse. He returned neither as an old man nor a young one, nor when early summer came the next year and the most audacious of them went in search of him, scaling the still snow-bound summit of the Pic du Canigou, did they find any trace of him. No clothes, no body parts, no bones. His teachings, however, suffered no damage at all. On the contrary, Soon the legend was abroad that there on the mountain peak he had wedded himself to the eternal fluidum vitale, merging with it and it with him, and now forever floated, invisible but eternally young, above the peaks of the Pyrenees, and whoever climbed up to him would encounter him there and remain untouched by sickness or the process of aging for 1 full year. Well into the 19th century, Theilhade's fluidal theory was advocated from many a chair at faculties of medicine and put into therapeutic practice by many an occult society. And even today, on both sides of the Pyrenees, particularly in Perpi, Ñan and Figueras, there are secret Theilhadic lodges that meet once a year to climb the Pic du Canigou. There they light a great bonfire, ostensibly for the summer solstice and in honor of St. John. But in reality it is to pay homage to their master, Theilhade Espinasse, and his grand fluidum, and to seek eternal life. 35. Whereas Grenouille had needed 7 years for the first stage of his journey through France, he put the second behind him in less than 7 days. He no longer avoided busy roads and cities. He made no detours. He had an odor. He had money. He had self-confidence, and he had no time to lose. By evening of the day he left Montpellier, he had arrived at Le Gros du Roi, a small harbor town southwest of Aigues-Mortes, where he boarded a merchant ship for Marseille. In Marseille he did not even leave the harbor, but immediately sought out a ship that brought him further along the coast to the east. 2 days later he was in Toulon, in 3 more in Cannes. The rest of the way he traveled on foot. He followed a back road that led up into the hills, northward into the interior. 2 hours later, he was standing on a rise, and before him was spread a valley several miles wide, a kind of basin in the landscape, its surrounding rim made up of gently rising hills and a ridge of steep mountains, its broad bowl covered with fields, gardens, and olive groves. The basin had its own special, intimate climate, although the sea was so near that one could see it from the tops of the hills. There was nothing maritime, nothing salty and sandy, nothing expansive about this climate. Instead, it possessed a secluded tranquility, as if you were many days' journey distant from the coast. And although to the north the high mountains were covered with snow that would remain for a good while yet, it was not in the least raw or barren, and no cold wind blew. Spring was further advanced than in Montpellier. A mild haze lay like a glass bell over the fields. Apricot and almond trees were in bloom, and the warm air was infused with the scent of jonquils. At the other end of the wide basin, perhaps 2 miles off, a town lay among, or better, clung to, the rising mountains. From a distance it did not make a particularly grand impression. There was no mighty cathedral towering above the houses, just a little stump of a church steeple, no commanding fortress, no magnificent edifice of note. The walls appeared anything but defiant. Here and there the houses spilled out from their limits, especially in the direction of the plain, lending the outskirts a somewhat disheveled look. It was as if the place had been overrun and then retaken so often that it was weary of offering serious resistance to any future intruders, not out of weakness, but out of indolence, or maybe even out of a sense of its own strength. It looked as if it had no need to flaunt itself. It reigned above the fragrant basin at its feet, and that seemed to suffice. This equally homely and self-confident place was the town of Grasse, for decades now the uncontested center for production of and commerce in scents, perfumes, soaps, and oils. Giuseppe Baldini had always uttered the name with enraptured delight. The town was the Rome of scents, the promised land of perfumes, and the man who had not earned his spurs here did not rightfully bear the title of perfumer. Grenouille gazed very coolly at the town of Grasse. He was not seeking the promised land of perfumers, and his heart did not leap at the sight of this small town clinging to the far slopes. He had come because he knew that he could learn about several techniques for production of scent there better than elsewhere, and he wanted to acquire them, for he needed them for his own purposes. He pulled the flaken with his perfume from his pocket, dabbed himself lightly, and continued on his way. An hour and a half later, around noon, he was in Grasse. He ate at an inn near the top of the town on the Place aux Aires. The square was divided lengthwise by a brook where tanners washed their hides and afterwards spread them out to dry. The odor was so pungent that many a guest lost his appetite for his meal. But not Grenouille. It was a familiar odor to him. It gave him a sense of security. In every city he always sought out the tanning district first, and then, emerging from that region of stench to explore the other parts of the place, he no longer felt a stranger. He spent all that afternoon wandering about the town. It was unbelievably filthy, despite, or perhaps directly because of, all the water that gushed from springs and wells, gurgling down through the town in unchanneled rivulets and brooks, undermining the streets or flooding them with muck. In some neighborhoods, the houses stood so close together that only a yard, wide space was left for passageways and stairs, forcing pedestrians to jostle one another as they waded through the mire. And even in the squares and along the few broader streets, vehicles could hardly get out of each other's way. Nevertheless, however filthy, cramped, and slovenly, the town was bursting with the bustle of commerce. During his tour, Grenouille spotted no less than 7 soapworks, a dozen master perfumers and glovers, countless small distilleries, pomade studios, and spice shops, and finally some 7 wholesalers in scents. These were in fact merchants who completely controlled the wholesale supply of scent. One would hardly know it by their houses. The facades to the street looked modestly middle class. But what was stored behind them in warehouses and in gigantic cellars, in kegs of oil, in stacks of finest lavender soaps, in demijohns of floral colognes, wines, alcohols, in bales of scented leather, in sacks and chests and crates stuffed with spices. Grenouille smelled out every detail through the thickest walls. These were riches beyond those of princes. And when he smelled his way more penetratingly through the prosaic shops and storerooms fronting the streets, he discovered that at the rear of these provincial family homes were buildings of the most luxurious sort. Around small but exquisite gardens where oleander and palm trees flourished and fountains bordered by ornamental flowers leapt, extended the actual residential wings, usually built in a U, shaped toward the south. On the upper floors, bedchambers drenched in sunlight, the walls covered with silk. On the ground floor, wainscoted salons and dining rooms, sometimes with terraces built out into the open air, where, just as Baldini had said, people ate from porcelain with golden cutlery. The gentlemen who lived behind these modest sham facades reeked of gold and power, of carefully secured riches, and they reeked of it more strongly than anything Grenouille had smelled thus far on his journey through the provinces. He stopped and stood for a good while in front of one of these camouflaged palazzi. The house was at the beginning of the Rue Droite, a main artery that traversed the whole length of the city, from west to east. It was nothing extraordinary to look at. Perhaps the front was a little wider and ampler than its neighbors, but certainly not imposing. At the gateway stood a wagon from which kegs were being unloaded down a ramp. A second vehicle stood waiting. A man with some papers went into the office, came back out with another man. Both of them disappeared through the gateway. Grenouille stood on the opposite side of the street and watched the comings and goings. He was not interested in what was happening, and yet he stood there. Something else was holding him fast. He closed his eyes and concentrated on the odors that came floating to him from the building across the way. There were the odors of the kegs, vinegar and wine, then the 100-fold heavy odors of the warehouse, then the odors of wealth that the walls exuded like a fine golden sweat, and finally the odors of a garden that had to lie on the far side of the building. It was not easy to catch the delicate scents of the garden, for they came only in thin ribbons from over the house's gables and down into the street. Grenouille discerned magnolia, hyacinth, daphne, and rhododendron, but there seemed to be something else besides, something in the garden that gave off a fatally wonderful scent, a scent so exquisite that in all his life his nose had never before encountered one like it, or indeed only once before. He had to get closer to that scent. He considered whether he ought simply to force his way through the gate and onto the premises. But meanwhile, so many people had become involved in unloading and inventorying the kegs that he was sure to be noticed. He decided to walk back down the street and find an alley or passageway that would perhaps lead him along the far side of the house. Within a few yards he had reached the town gate at the start of the Rue Droit. He walked through it, took a sharp left, and followed the town wall downhill. He had not gone far before he smelled the garden, faintly at first, blended with the air from the fields, but then ever more strongly. Finally he knew that he was very close. The garden bordered on the town wall. It was directly beside him. If he moved back a bit, he could see the top branches of the orange trees just over the wall. Again he closed his eyes. The sense of the garden descended upon him, their contours as precise and clear as the colored bands of a rainbow. And that one, that precious one, that one that mattered above all else, was among them. Grenouille turned hot with rapture and cold with fear. Blood rushed to his head as if he were a little boy caught red-handed, and then it retreated to his solar plexus, and then rushed up again and retreated again, and he could do nothing to stop it. This attack of scent had come on too suddenly. For a moment, for a breath, for an eternity it seemed to him. Time was doubled or had disappeared completely, for he no longer knew whether now was now, and here was here, or whether now was not in fact then, and here there. That is, the Rue des Marais in Paris, September 1753. The scent floating out of the garden was the scent of the red-headed girl he had murdered that night. To have found that scent in this world once again brought tears of bliss to his eyes, and to know that it could not possibly be true frightened him to death. He was dizzy, he tottered a little and had to support himself against the wall, sinking slowly down against it in a crouch. Collecting himself and gaining control of his senses, he began to inhale the fatal scent in short, less dangerous breaths, and he established that, while the scent from behind the wall bore an extreme resemblance to the scent of the red-headed girl, it was not completely the same. To be sure, it also came from a red-headed girl. There was no doubt of that. In his olfactory imagination, Grenouille saw this girl as if in a picture. She was not sitting still. She was jumping about, warming up and then cooling off, apparently playing some game in which she had to move quickly, and then just as quickly stand still. With a second person, by the way, someone with a totally insignificant odor. She had dazzlingly white skin. She had green eyes. She had freckles on her face, neck, and breasts, that is. And Grenouille's breath stopped for a moment. Then he sniffed more vigorously and tried to suppress the memory of the scent of the girl from the Rue des Marais. That is, this girl did not even have breasts in the true sense of the word. She barely had the rudimentary start of breasts, infinitely tender and with hardly any fragrance, sprinkled with freckles just beginning to expand, perhaps only in the last few days, perhaps in the last few hours, perhaps only just at this moment. Such were the little cupped breasts of this girl. In a word, the girl was still a child, but what a child! The sweat stood out on Grenouille's forehead. He knew that children did not have an exceptional scent, any more than green buds of flowers before they blossom. This child behind the wall, however, this bud still almost closed tight, which only just now was sending out its first fragrant tips, unnoticed by anyone except by him, Grenouille. This child already had a scent so terrifyingly celestial that once it had unfolded its total glory, it would unleash a perfume such as the world had never smelled before. She already smells better now, Grenouille thought, than that girl did back then in the Rue des Marais. Not as robust, not as voluminous, but more refined, more richly nuanced, and at the same time more natural. In a year or two, this scent will be ripened and take on a gravity that no one man or woman will be able to escape. People will be overwhelmed, disarmed, helpless before the magic of this girl, and they will not know why. And because people are stupid and use their noses only for blowing, but believe absolutely anything they see with their eyes, they will say it is because this is a girl with beauty and grace and charm. In their obtuseness, they will praise the evenness of her features, her slender figure, her faultless breasts, and her eyes, they will say, are like emeralds and her teeth like pearls, and her limbs smooth as ivory, and all those other idiotic comparisons. And they will elect her Queen of the Jasmine, and she will be painted by stupid portraitists. Her picture will be ogled, and people will say that she is the most beautiful woman in France. And to the strains of mandolins, youths will howl the nights away sitting beneath her window. Rich, fat old men will skid about on their knees begging her father for her hand. And women of every age will sigh at the sight of her and in their sleep dream of looking as alluring as she for just one day. And none of them will know that it is truly not how she looks that has captured them, not her reputed unblemished external beauty, but solely her incomparable, splendid scent. Only he would know that. Only Grenouille, he alone. He knew it already, in fact. He wanted to have that scent. Not in the useless, clumsy fashion by which he had had the scent of the girl in the Rue des Marais, for he had merely sucked that. Possessed the scent of this girl behind the wall, to peel it from her like skin and to make her scent his own. How that was to be done he did not know yet, but he had 2 years in which to learn. Ultimately, it ought to be no more difficult than robbing a rare flower of its perfume. He stood up almost reverently, as if leaving behind something sacred or someone in deep sleep. He moved on softly, hunched over, so that no one might see him, no one might hear him, no one might be made aware of his precious discovery. And so he fled along the wall to the opposite end of the town, where he finally lost the girl's scent and re-entered by way of the Porte des Fainéants. He stood in the shadow of the buildings. The stinking vapors of the streets made him feel secure and helped him to tame the passions that had overcome him. Within 15 minutes he had grown perfectly calm again. To start with, he thought, he would not again approach the vicinity of the garden behind the wall. That was not necessary. It excited him too much. The flower would flourish there without his aid, and he knew already in what manner it would flourish. He dared not intoxicate himself with that scent prematurely. He had to throw himself into his work. He had to broaden his knowledge and perfect the techniques of his craft in order to be equipped for the time of harvest. He had a good 2 years.